The War of 1812. Most of us don't know much about it. Depending on our nationality, we may not have been taught much about it in school. Not much was accomplished or changed as a consequence of it. People in Britain may view it as a minor sideshow in history to more important events going on at the same time. Americans may view it as a defining event that shaped their young nation, tested it, and brought cohesiveness and purpose to a diverse young country. Canadians may also see it as an important struggle that brought their nation together and helped to mold it as it moved toward eventual independence. We'll take a closer look now and see what the truth is. In the 1783 Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolutionary War, the Americans were promised the Great Lakes region, called the Northwest Territory. That is what is today Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, and parts of Minnesota. Though the British continued to maintain military forces in that region. In 1794, the Jay Treaty, which normalized trade between the British and the Americans, required the British to withdraw military forces from their forts in the Northwest region. The British maintained a policy of supplying and arming the Indians in the Northwest Territory, with a goal of propping up a large Indian buffer state to block the westward expansion of the United States. William Henry Harrison, military governor of the Indiana Territory, which was part of the Northwest Territory, oversaw treaty negotiations with the Indian tribes in the region, leading to Indians ceding land rights to the American settlers. In 1811, Harrison won a sweeping victory over Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his Indian Confederation at the Battle of Tippecanoe. This opened the door to increased American settlement in the territory. It also drove Tecumseh and his Indian forces to ally more closely with the British. This alliance between the British and the Indians drove increased American anger. Henry Clay and the War Hawks in Congress had an expressed desire to seize parts of Canada from Great Britain. There was also a desire to seize Florida from the Spanish. The British aggressively sought out and apprehended sailors who they considered to be runaway British subjects. In the 9 years leading up to the War of 1812, as many as 9,000 sailors were abducted from American ships and pressed into service in the British Navy. Of those, as many as 75% were American citizens. Altercations between American and British ships off the American coast, such as the 1807 USS Chesapeake versus HMS Leopard affair, as well as the 1811 USS President versus HMS Little Belt affair, led to American anger and calls for war. Britain and France maintained embargoes against each other during the ongoing Napoleonic Wars. American merchant ships were often harassed by both the British and French navies if they perceived the American ships to be violating their embargoes. This led to the American 1807 Embargo Act, which forbade American exports to any foreign nation. By 1809, President Thomas Jefferson and Congress repealed this partly with the 1809 Non-Intercourse Act, which was aimed more narrowly at Britain and France, banning trade only with those countries. The idea was that the British in particular, being dependent on American supplies, would be forced to come to terms. During their struggle with Napoleon, the British in 1807 issued their famous Orders in Council, which restricted neutral nations trading with France. This added to increased tensions between the United States and Britain. Now we understand the fourfold motivation of the United States in going to war. Number 1, resentment toward the British policy of impressing formerly British sailors from American ships. Number 2, desire among some elements within the American government to gain territory in Canada at the expense of Britain, and in Florida at the expense of Spain. Number 3, harassment by the British against American merchant ships in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. And number 4, anger at the British policy of arming American Indian tribes to the west of American territory. In 1809, James Madison succeeded Thomas Jefferson as president. In 1812, Congress, led by Henry Clay's Warhawk faction, authorized Madison to increase the size of the army. President Madison and Henry Clay's faction in Congress urged a declaration of war. The Federalist Party in the northeastern states, and especially New England, were adamantly opposed to war with Great Britain because their economies were dependent on trade. On June 17, 1812, Congress approved a declaration of war against Great Britain, though. Interestingly, while this was going on, the British Parliament was simultaneously working to normalize trade relations with the United States as a compromise measure. The British were heavily engaged in Europe in the ongoing Napoleonic Wars at the time. North America was seen as a peripheral concern for them. They could not afford to send large numbers of reinforcements. The British leader in Canada, General George Prevost, knowing he only had limited troops, decided to engage in a defensive strategy. The British Navy had only limited ships in North America, but still outnumbered the U.S. Navy. They operated out of their bases at Halifax and in Bermuda. The Royal Navy's main priority was to protect British merchant shipping, but soon an order was given to blockade the American coast to restrict trade. This would end up seriously hurting the American economy. Madison approved a three-pronged American attack on British Canada. The first prong would aim straight north from Montreal. The second would aim westward across the Niagara River into Upper Canada, which is present-day Ontario. The third prong would attack Upper Canada from the other side, aiming eastward from Detroit. Soon Fort Mackinac, which guarded the passage between Lakes Huron and Michigan, was seized by a combined British and Indian force. Then on August 15, 1812, the American Fort Dearborn, which is present-day Chicago, was evacuated by the Americans. The American attack prong that was to go from Detroit into Ontario, commanded by William Hull, ran into trouble and had to retreat back to Detroit. The British counterattacked, and a force led by General Isaac Brock captured Detroit on August 16, 1812. Now with Dearborn, Mackinac, and Detroit all lost, the American position in the Northwest Territory was suddenly very vulnerable. Young Captain Zachary Taylor led a successful defense of Fort Harrison, though, against invading Indians, which prevented the Americans from being completely pushed back to the Ohio River. Hull was relieved of command, and then William Henry Harrison took over leadership in the American Northwest. The offensive in the middle, westward across the Niagara River into Upper Canada, fared no better, and part of the reason was that the New York and Pennsylvania militias refused to leave American territory and invade a foreign country. And then the eastern offensive that was to proceed northward against Montreal also failed due to the refusal of state militias to participate in foreign invasions. President Madison authorized American Navy Commodore John Rodgers to lead a squadron of 4 ships to search for British convoys to attack. To counter this, the British were forced to divert some of their ships that were engaged in blockading American ports. Because the British were now compelled to search for Rodgers, their blockade was weakened. In August 1812, the USS Constitution, commanded by Captain Isaac Hull, fought the famous battle with HMS Guerriere. This victory was good news to the Americans, and it was in contrast to the otherwise long list of bad news they had received thus far in the war. The Navy was given increased funding as a result of this. Other victories followed. In October 1812, the USS United States, under Stephen Decatur, defeated the HMS Macedonian. In December 1812, the USS Constitution, under William Bainbridge, defeated HMS Java off the coast of Brazil. On February 24, 1813, USS Hornet, under the commander James Lawrence, defeated HMS Peacock off the coast of Guyana. Lawrence later commanded USS Chesapeake, which was defeated off the coast of Massachusetts by HMS Shannon. Lawrence was killed in that battle. A continuing vulnerability for the Americans was their naval position on the Great Lakes. In the spring of 1813, Commodore Isaac Chauncey was placed in command of American naval forces on Lakes Erie and Ontario. He oversaw the building of American vessels on these lakes and also the capture of British ones. In March 1813, the British, assisted by Tecumseh's forces and Canadian militia, marched south from their captured Detroit stronghold and laid siege to William Henry Harrison's men in Fort Meigs and in Fort Stephenson, which are in present-day Ohio. The sieges failed and the Americans retained their positions. In April 1813, Chauncey transported a force led by General Zebulon Pike in an attack across the lake against York, which is present-day Toronto, then the capital of Upper Canada. The raid aimed to capture British ships, but only one was found. The main British force retreated, though Pike was killed in the fighting. The Americans withdrew, but on the way out, some ill-disciplined American soldiers set fire to government buildings in contradiction to their orders. In a renewed offensive on the Niagara River on May 27, 1813, Colonel Winfield Scott led a successful attack on Fort George and captured it. The Americans then captured Fort Erie, which put them in control of the entire Canadian side of the Niagara River. The Americans failed to gain much advantage from their new strong position, because in June the British and their Indian allies defeated the Americans at the Battle of Beaver Dams, and the Americans were not able to penetrate further into Canada. The naval commander of American forces on Lake Erie was Oliver Hazard Perry. The American base was at Presque Isle in Pennsylvania. The British commander was Robert Barclay, based at Amherstburg in Ontario. On September 10, 1813, Perry's fleet won the famous victory on Lake Erie over the British squadron. This opened up Canada for further American invasion attempts and also strengthened the American position in the Ohio Valley. During this time, the Spanish controlled their East and West Florida territories, which included parts of present-day Alabama and Mississippi. The Spanish and British armed and supplied the Creek Indians in the southeastern United States in order to serve as a buffer to protect the Florida territories against encroaching American settlers. In April 1813, General James Wilkinson had led an American force which seized the Spanish settlement in West Florida on the site of present-day Mobile, Alabama. Andrew Jackson had offered to raise volunteers from Tennessee to assist in this, but his offer was refused. The so-called Creek War began in July 1813 between the Creek Indians and the American settlers, supported by the U.S. Army. The Creek wanted to protect their traditional lands against encroaching American settlers. Andrew Jackson led a force to attack the Creek, who were led by William Weatherford. The Cherokee Indians allied with the Americans in this struggle. There were a series of bloody battles and pursuits. The war would end with an American victory in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend on March 27, 1814. The Creek were forced to sign a treaty with the U.S. government, ceding their territory in Alabama and Georgia, putting the Americans in a much stronger position in the southeast. In June of 1813, the British took control of Lake Champlain. In the fall of 1813, William Henry Harrison assembled a force at Fort Meigs, which would march north and capture Fort Detroit back from the British. With American control of the area re-established, they then crossed into Ontario, where they defeated a British force led by General Henry Proctor at the Thames River in October 1813. Tecumseh was killed in this battle, and this finally ended his Confederacy. In October 1813, General Wade Hampton led another American invasion of Lower Canada, but he was defeated. In November, General James Wilkinson, along with Winfield Scott, led another American offensive against Montreal. As they advanced into British territory, the coming of winter forced them to stop and dig in. In December 1813, the Americans, who will remember had been holed in Fort George since May, decided to evacuate back to Fort Niagara on the American side. On their way out, the New York militia burned the nearby Canadian town of Newark. This enraged the British, who then counterattacked and burned Buffalo, New York in revenge. Napoleon's forces were defeated by a coalition of Russian, Austrian, Prussian, Swedish, and British forces on March 31, 1814 at the Battle of Leipzig. With Napoleon exiled to Elba, now the British could divert more forces to North America. The Americans had thus far failed to capture and hold any significant territory in Canada. They had failed to win any maritime concessions from the British, and now the British were ready to teach the Americans a lesson. In June of 1814, Governor-General Sir George Prevost received orders to commence an invasion of the United States down the Hudson Valley, the same route that General John Burgoyne had led his forces along in their ill-fated Saratoga campaign in the American Revolution. On July 3, 1814, American General Jacob Brown, along with Winfield Scott, led a raid against Fort Erie, which resulted in its capture. The way down the Niagara River to Fort George lay open now. The British dug in near the Chippewa River to try and stem the American advance downstream. The following day, Scott's troops defeated them. This was a major morale booster for the Americans. Brown intended to march down to the Ontario River and link up with Chauncey's naval forces and then attack York. This naval support did not come though, and the British, led by General Gordon Drummond, stopped the American advance with a stalemate battle at Lundy's Lane in July 1814. In August 1814, General Drummond led forces to attack Fort Erie but were repelled. The Americans would evacuate that fort by November anyway. Drummond's leadership thus stemmed the American advance into Upper Canada, but the improved American military performance showed that the U.S. Army had come a long way and could engage the British successfully on the ground. As part of the planned British invasion down the Hudson Valley, on September 11, 1814, the British naval force on Lake Champlain, under Captain George Downey, attacked the American force under Captain Thomas MacDonough. The Americans won the battle, and this stopped the British southward advance. In 1814, the last of the American embargo acts were repealed, but the British tightened their blockade, which strangled American commerce. In August 1814, British Admiral Sir George Cockburn and General Robert Ross led a British raid up the Chesapeake Bay toward Washington. As the British came up the Potomac, the Americans organized a defense led by General William Winder. The British landed, and after some fighting, the Americans retreated. The British then defeated the American defenders at Bladensburg, and as the Americans fled, the British were able to advance into Washington and burn several government buildings in retaliation for the burnings the Americans had committed in York in 1813. The British departed, and General Winder and Secretary of War John Armstrong resigned. Ross and Cockburn next sailed to Baltimore, and on September 12, 1814, Ross's men disembarked and marched toward the city. The American defenders under General Samuel Smith stopped the British advance, and Ross was killed. On the night of September 13th, the British bombarded Fort McHenry. As famously told, the American flag could still be seen in the morning, so the British decided to discontinue their assault and withdrew on September 14, 1814. The 1814 Hartford Convention was a meeting of Federalist delegates in Hartford, Connecticut, that came from Northeast states to discuss ways to oppose President Madison's war policies and even explore the possibility of secession. The New England states were frustrated at the effects on their economy from the blockade and also at the British occupation of some of their territory, such as in Maine. Word got out to the rest of the country, and the negative publicity ruined the Federalist image. This was the beginning of the end of the party. During 1814, there were peace negotiations ongoing in Ghent, Belgium, between the British and the Americans. These ran concurrently with the Congress of Vienna, which was busy establishing a post-Napoleon balance of power in Europe. The British negotiators would have liked to see the war end, with their nation gaining territory in North America. The British hero, Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, though, advised them that their position was not as strong as they thought. The British had been stopped in their advance southward at Lake Champlain. Their Chesapeake campaign had been stopped at Baltimore, and the situation on the Niagara River was a stalemate. He advised them to agree to keep the status quo ante bellum, and ultimately this is what the Americans agreed to, that the territorial situation would remain the same after the war as it was at the beginning. Both sides agreed to restore any Indian territory they had captured, though the land gained by Harrison's victory at Tippecanoe and by Jackson's victory at Horseshoe Bend would never be reversed. While the peace treaty was still being negotiated, the British continued to prosecute the war in order not to weaken their position. They also perhaps hoped to capture some territory which they could keep after the war. In November 1814, General Andrew Jackson's forces seized the Spanish settlement of Pensacola. Spain was an ally of Britain at this time. A British invasion in the area of the Gulf Coast was expected, and Jackson faced the need to defend Pensacola along with Mobile and New Orleans at the same time. The British general, Sir Edward Pakenham, a brother-in-law of Wellington, received orders to attack New Orleans, which would give the British control of the strategic city guarding the mouth of the Mississippi waterway. The British landed in December 1814 and fought their way toward the city. Andrew Jackson assembled a mixed force of U.S. Army regulars, militia volunteers, free blacks, and Indian allies. The Americans stopped the British on January 8, 1815. Pakenham was killed. The British withdrew. Neither side knew that the peace treaty had been signed in Ghent on December 24, 1814. The British Parliament had approved the treaty in late December 1814. Jackson maintained his forces in a defensive posture at New Orleans while he awaited official word that the peace treaty was ratified by his government. In February 1815, Congress approved of the treaty. The treaty dictated that captured land and ships were supposed to be returned to their previous owners. American-held areas in Upper Canada were to be returned to Britain. Likewise, British-held areas around Lake Superior in Michigan and in Maine were returned to American control, though in Spanish West Florida, the Americans kept Mobile and only returned Pensacola to Spain. The British could not restore the Indian Confederacy that they had supported, and that they had hoped would stop the westward American advance. And as mentioned, the Americans kept the territory they had gained at Tippecanoe and at Horseshoe Bend. American control of the Northwest Territory would remain, and new states would be carved out of that. In the coming years, new states would be admitted in the Gulf Coast region alongside Louisiana. The Americans failed to gain any concessions on maritime rights. The issue of impressment was not even mentioned in the document. The war has remained in American memory as an important coming-of-age event for the diverse young nation. Pride over the victory at New Orleans surged. The Star-Spangled Banner eventually became the national anthem. Important leaders such as Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison would go on to take even more important places in American history. The young United States Navy, having proved itself, would be expanded further. Continued American westward expansion was secured. Britain's view of the war relegates it to more of a sideshow to the Napoleonic Wars occurring at the same time. They had prevented the Americans from taking Canada, and Canadians, moving toward autonomy from Britain later in the century, would look back with pride in the part that their militias played in stopping the Americans. The war served as a factor in shaping a Canadian national identity. Britain and the United States would go on to eventually achieve a rapprochement and become allies. Though much remained unchanged after the war, we look back on the conflict as a decisive chapter in the history of these three nations.